All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I believe this is episode 45 or 46. But we are reading Citizens, Cops, and Power by Steve Herbert. We're beginning chapter 4. Chapter 4, quote, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid," end quote, on the resistance to community policing. In the 1990s, the Seattle Police Department attempted an ambitious reform effort. Under the leadership of Chief Norm Stamper, who had been brought to Seattle from San Diego, the department tried to reorient all of its operations around the philosophy of community policing. For Stamper, this meant making the police an agency through which myriad efforts at neighborhood betterment could be channeled. The police would listen closely to a wide range of citizen complaints and would address as many of them as possible. This might mean soliciting assistance from other branches of the state's bureaucracy on matters outside the police's expertise. But the mandate of the police was deliberately broad. It was to be the linchpin agency in neighborhood efforts and self-improvement. Stamper recognized that such a thoroughgoing effort at organizational change would require the support of the rank and file. Given the amount of discretionary authority low-level police operatives possess, and given the well-documented pattern of effective resistance to similar efforts at police reform, Stamper's commitment to devoting attention to ensuring, quote, buy-in, end quote, from lower levels of the hierarchy was clearly well advised. To this end, he regularly invited officers to short seminars on the philosophy of community policing. The goal was clear: to encourage officers to accept community policing as their principal vocational orientation. These seminars remain the butt of frequent sarcastic jokes inside the SPD. Commonly, officers refer to invitations to the seminars as requests to, quote, drink the Kool-Aid, end quote. The reference here is to the 1978 Jonestown Massacre, when more than 900 followers of Jim Jones drank cyanide-laced Kool-Aid rather than surrendering their territory in Guyana. Some officers ridiculed the language used at the seminars in which leaders allegedly discussed, quote, the rivers of community policing, end quote, to emphasize the breadth of the reform movement. The persistence of such sarcasm illustrates the hostility with which many viewed the project of community policing. Why such hostility? Why would officers refuse to reorient themselves as the Stamper advocated? Why resist efforts to deepen the police's connection to neighborhoods, to broaden their mandate in ameliorating the problems citizens enumerate? Why is organizational reform akin to committing suicide? In Chapter 3, I showed that police impulses toward subservience to citizenry are tempered by the projects of separation and generativity. The importance of these latter two projects limits the police's ability to envision citizens as co-equal partners. This reality has telling implications for the success of community policing. Why is the calibration of the police's mission in this fashion so difficult for officers to accept? My arguments here extend to those of Chapter 3. I opened up further the, quote, black box, end quote, of the state and outlined the internal dynamics most critical to police resistance to community policing. In the first section, I explored the importance of the capacity to exercise coercive force to particular tendencies within the police subculture, tendencies that reinforce the police's sense of themselves as members of an authoritative agency sharply distinct from the citizenry. I followed this by exploring how this authority gets expressed organizationally. I focused particularly on how different actors within the bureaucracy work in relative isolation to attain an independent measure of prestige. These emphases on specialization and discretion lessen the organization's capacity to coordinate officers' efforts to solve problems identified by the public. I then explored the common narrative officers employ to understand criminality. This hegemonic story describes crime as acts of a few, quote, bad apples, end quote, within a given area. By extension, the project of policing is to exercise these bad actors through arrest and incarceration. Importantly, such a narrative implicitly reinforces the power of the police as the agent of expulsion. Citizens are thereby viewed largely in terms of their ability to provide information about those who need to be expelled. The public is not understood as the police's co-equal partner. One second. Collectively, these internal dynamics help thwart the project of subservience in everyday practice. They prevent more equitable partnerships between the police and neighborhood groups. Officers' collective sense of themselves as capable, authoritative actors extracting evildoers limits the extent to which they can embrace community policing. By encouraging each other to resist change, the officers reinforce their sense of separation from the public. They thereby obstruct the democratic thrust central to the legitimation of community policing. This sense of separation frustrates many citizens, as is explored further in Chapter 5. For now, my goal is to explain how dynamics within the police organization motivate the effort to ensure that officers do not, quote, drink the Kool-Aid, end quote. And then that brings us to the first stopping point in this chapter. And I think the first thing that stands out to me, not just simply from these a few pages that we've read in this chapter, but from everything that we've read in totality up to this point in this book, is not just simply the illegitimacy of community policing, but the illegitimacy of policing as an institution in general, because of the fact that this institution sees itself as separate from the citizens, because of the fact that this institution does not see itself as part of the community. And I don't believe that there's any type of way to extract what would be considered quote unquote crime inside of a community without being part of that community and having an intimate understanding of why crime is being committed there. And so those are some of my first initial thoughts so far as we begin reading those first couple of pages. But let's continue in. Coercive force and cultural fundamentals of the police. Any explanation for why the police tend to keep the public at arm's length must take seriously several components of police culture and organization. Like all social organizations, the police never enact themselves in a simple, uniform fashion. It is far too limiting to consider the police solely as one component of some abstract entity called the state, whose direction can be determined or directed by normative political theory. Instead, we need to understand the internal dynamics of the police, the key components of their culture, and the central narratives they use to understand themselves, their work, and their relations with the public. Of course, these internal dynamics are critically shaped by external forces. The most significant of these is the designation of the police as the state's primary agent of coercive force. As Bittner long ago recognized, what unites the disparate actions police are asked to undertake is their capacity to compel a response forcibly if necessary. Police are summoned to such a wide array of scenes because someone believed that coercive force might be necessary to resolve a problematic situation. One critical implication of the police's capacity to exercise force is its influence on the subcultural world One critical implication of the police's capacity to exercise force is its influence on the subcultural world officers construct. Dominant features of that culture can be traced to the coercive role officers are equipped, literally, to play. I focus here on three main components of that culture. One is an emphasis on a masculinist notion of adventurousness embraced by many officers. A second is an understandable preoccupation with safety. The third, and here I revisit some of my discussion in Chapter 3, is the widespread belief that police authority needs to be asserted effectively. Each of these subcultural components can be traced back to the coercive authority of the police, and each underlies officer resistance to a robust role for the citizenry in shaping police practice. Adventure/machismo. As the state's principal agency of coercion, the police are regularly summoned to potentially dangerous situations. Citizens call the police when under physical threat and ask officers to deal with those who pose such a threat. The police are thereby obligated to insert themselves into situations where the possibility of violence looms and to use violence themselves if necessary to protect the vulnerable. As Busa describes As Busa describes the transformation that accompanied his initial entry into the police fraternity, quote, "Once I put on the badge and uniform, I was expected to run towards things I formerly ran away from." Many officers embrace this challenge. Such officers quickly volunteer to handle calls that represent risk. They seek opportunities to turn on lights and siren in pursuit of a particularly notorious perpetrator. They use discretionary patrol time to unearth chances to exert their authority. They cruise in higher crime areas, hoping to encounter foes of the police against whom they can test their mettle. The valorization of this approach to policing means that officers assess one another in terms of their willingness to handle dangerous calls. Those who seem reluctant to do so are disparaged as something less than full-fledged police officers. Some police, for example, joke about older officers with ebbing energy for proactive work as being, quote, retired on duty, end quote. Another officer, after a conversation with a colleague who wished not to pursue a suspect who had fled a scene, derided him by saying, quote, "Obviously, he has a motivation problem," end quote. This cultural celebration of adventurousness generates two important implications for community policing. One is that many officers ridicule the slow-paced, heavily interactive work of engaging the citizenry. There is little adventure in community meetings during which the conversation predictably drags through minutiae and includes performances of pettifogging. Nor is there much excitement in trying to coordinate with other agencies to improve poor lighting or prevent the dumping of unwanted materials in an alleyway. Indeed, such aspects of community policing are commonly dismissed as, quote, social work and are implicitly feminized as such. These are not matters for the strong, masculinist, adventurous officer. Further, officers who work patrol rarely stood to associate themselves with those involved in community policing efforts. Rather, community policing is regularly denigrated as a refuge for those who seek to avoid hard work and danger, a place to, quote, work banker's hours, end quote, and avoid the rough and tumble that, quote, real police work, end quote, necessarily entails. I explore this bureaucratic isolation of community policing in more detail later in this chapter. For now, I note that an important contributor to that isolation is the association between community policing and the more feminized work of relationship building. This is not lost on community police team members themselves. On several of my ride-alongs with members of this team, I witnessed officers jumping at opportunities to respond to radio broadcasts concerning potentially violent situations. In some cases, the officers turned on their lights and sirens to respond to calls from locations that were several miles away. Because the intervening streets were heavily trafficked, their response time was likely to be slow, a factor that called into question their willingness to respond. Similarly, an officer serving as the community policing officer for Blufftop rejected a suggestion by the project's manager that he schedule regular hours in a publicly accessible office so that residents could approach him with their concerns. The officer indicated that he would not waste his time, quote, sitting in an office and playing solitaire, end quote. Instead, he patrolled the streets in search of street-level drug dealers. The lure of a major arrest trumped the boring work of community interaction. This desire to remain connected to the adventuresome side of policing helps explain enthusiasm for a short-lived, quote, power community policing model, end quote, with which their unit experimented during the period of the research. Instead of leaving the officers to their own devices to address the problems in their areas, the, quote, power, end quote, model coalesced the several members of the unit. As a group, they could engage in concentrated anti-crime activity in areas of ongoing concern. On occasion, for example, officers created a, quote, buy bust, end quote, operation to arrest street-level drug dealers. The community police officers enjoyed this taste of proactive, adventurous policing and were displeased when the experiment was terminated. So even for those officers ostensibly committed to the slow, patient work of community building, the call of adventure continues to beckon. A second important implication of the embrace of adventurousness is its tendency to legitimate brusqueness. If officers seek to encounter and overcome the more dangerous members of the citizenry, they recognize the need to establish their greater power. Unfortunately, tools for isolating those in need of such displays of power are crude. As a consequence, the police sometimes assert their superiority against those who present no appreciable threat. And when officers, in the words of one resident, quote, act all macho, end quote, it can erode public trust in the police. The possibility that adventurousness will erode the tenor of police-citizen interactions also holds true for officers' embrace of safety. And so then on that note, let's take a moment and readjust real quick. I think one of the things that stands out to me from that passage is how regularly that type of machismo attitude, that type of desire for adventure and for some type of quote unquote action, are usually that action is found in that desire for adventure is fulfilled in working class communities, in poor communities, in communities of color, because they for one of the reasons is because those are the areas where there is more likely to be the type of activity going on that they will have the option to exercise that machismo attitude in. Another one of the reasons for that as well, though, is that they're not going to go in and rough up and look for adventure and look to exercise their machismo attitude on people who will be able to file lawsuits against them, on people who will be able to go to the media or to have a platform to expose the officers who did these things or expose the agency that's doing these things and have some type of and it be some type of punishment for them doing these things. So they're not going to go to middle class neighborhoods and upper class neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods and white neighborhoods where lawyers are working, where lawyers live and doctors live and other police officers may live and politicians may live and do these things. They're going to go to places where people who are unemployed live, people who are in public housing, people who are felons are at. So that way, when they do these things, those people don't have a voice to speak and get attention on these actions. I think another one of the things that's important to point out is how this type of attitude, this type of adventure-seeking mentality, which is rampant through the Rockford Police Department, which is rampant through, I would say, the majority of police departments, especially in cities with 100,000 people or more. These type of attitudes lead to the macroaggressions of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And those macroaggressions are people being shot down in the streets by police officers, are people dying in the custody of police officers, are people being beat in the custody of police officers. And that's the way that they fulfill this desire for adventure. You know, the same thing about how the same concept goes for the high-speed pursuits. They talked about in here how police officers from blocks away, miles away, will put on their lights to try to fly to a scene if they feel like they might have some type of action or it might be some type of an adventurous encounter. And that's something that we've seen here. That's how these high-speed pursuits happen. These officers, somebody's just simply speeding, and since they don't slow down, the officer now feels that they can engage in their desire for adventure by chasing this person down down main streets in a city, and that leads a lot of times to some innocent bystander, an innocent motorist being collateral damage when car accidents happen, whether it be what's happened here before in the past where Rockford Police Department officers have crashed their cars into bystanders and pedestrians, or into bystanders into another car that they weren't chasing, or if the car that they're chasing crashes into another car, and that's not the police car. There have been all types of ways that these high-speed pursuits have manifested onto citizens of this community, and it has taken the lives of people a lot of times who are not even involved in the pursuit. And those things are not done to keep the city safer, or to keep the street safer, or to make traffic safer, or to keep the community safer. Those things are done because of an officer's desire to play Vin Diesel on the streets, and to try to again fulfill that desire for adventure. And so I think that that's again another one of the things that we've seen manifest here. And I think that these are another one of the ways that delegitimizes police for people who have dealt with them. When you it's hard to see police officers giving traffic tickets as legitimate when you've watched police officers fly through lights for no reason, and speed through lights for no reason, and turn their sirens on just so they can get through a light instead of sitting there. It's hard to believe in the legitimacy of police arresting somebody for a vehicular manslaughter charge when we live in a city where police officers have regularly crashed their cars or caused car crashes that have led to people's death from high-speed pursuits over people speeding, or over simple traffic violations. Okay, here, let's take a moment real quick. All right, let's try to knock out one more little segment here. Safety. The centrality of safety to the cultural world of the police is understandable. Given that the police's coercive capacity compels them to enter dangerous situations, it is hardly a surprise that officers do a great deal to protect themselves. Safety is reinforced in a host of ways, from formal training and tactics to gentle admonitions to one another to, quote, stay safe out there, end quote. Officers are encouraged to make safety a paramount concern and to approach situations carefully to maximize their own protection. One important manifestation of this is officers' treatment of suspects, particularly those officers believe might pose some threat. Officers are likely to engage such suspects verbally only after first ensuring that they are not dangerous. The typical means for doing so is a, quote, pat down, end quote, of the citizen in question. Because officers are legally permitted to conduct such, quote, pat downs, end quote, as long as they can demonstrate concern for their safety, they regularly employ them. Unfortunately, such suspicion is not always directed accurately. To illustrate this point, let me return to a scenario I discussed briefly in Chapter 3. An officer I observed spent about an hour one morning trying to track down an African-American man, Ethan, who had allegedly barged into the apartment of his girlfriend and taken $500. According to the woman's son, the suspect had knocked on the door of the apartment, brushed past the boy when the door was opened, found $500 in the woman's bedroom, and dashed away. The officer got a statement from the boy and began scouring the neighborhood for information about Ethan's whereabouts. He visited several apartments and gathered a rough picture of the suspect's physical characteristics and clothing. At one point in the process, he looked up the block and noticed an African-American man walking down the sidewalk. The officer quickly jumped into his car, surged up the block, parked, jumped out, and commanded the man to place his hands on the hood of the car. The officer conducted a hurried pat-down, brushing off the man's questions. The officer said, quote, The officer said, quote, I'll explain everything in a moment, end quote, then proceeded with some questions about Ethan. After gaining little insight from the man, the officer briefly explained that he was looking for Ethan because he, quote, assaulted a 10-year-old kid, end quote. Unsatisfied by the explanation, the recipient of the search asked the officer, do you do this to everybody? The unstated message was clear. The man believed he received such rough attention because of his skin color. For his part, the officer later justified the search because he thought the man matched the description of Ethan and thus represented a potentially dangerous suspect who might elude capture. The officer believed his safety was sufficiently at risk to legitimate the pat-down. Regardless of this logic, the result in this case appeared to be a diminution of police legitimacy in the eyes of at least one citizen. When this scenario is repeated in Seattle and other cities, even in the name of the much vaunted goal of safety, it can compromise the closer police-community connections community policing promotes. Concerns for safety also lead some officers to resist efforts to reduce the physical distance between themselves and citizens. These include, most prominently, efforts to get officers to patrol via some mechanism other than a patrol car. Because such alternate modes of transport, foot, bicycle, horse, create less of a barrier between officer and citizen and thus ostensibly promote a stronger flow of communication, they are frequently touted as important facets of community policing. But the patrol car is tied to officers' sense of safety. It enables officers to enter and exit a scene quickly, which might be important tactically. It can provide an actual shield between officers and potential assailants, and it contains an in-car terminal that allows ready access to a database from which officers can retrieve information about a suspect in a situation. This helps officers to assess the dangerousness of a scene they are about to enter. Even community police officers whose mission revolves around citizen contact express reluctance to eschew the patrol car for fear of compromising their safety. Concerns for safety also help to explain why officers are preoccupied with ensuring that their authority is unquestioned in their interactions with the citizenry. And so I think that the main thing that stands out to me there is the passage that they wrote here. One second. Okay. Regardless of this logic, the result in this case appeared to be a diminution of police legitimacy in the eyes of at least one citizen. When this scenario is repeated in Seattle and other cities, even in the name of much vaunted goal of safety, it can compromise the closer police-community connections community policing promotes. And I think that goes further than just the community policing being delegitimized. I think that the whole of the institution of policing is delegitimized and has been delegitimized generation after generation of people who have dealt with fitting the description, who have dealt with having their rights completely violated by police officers because of the color of their skin or because of the community that they're from or because of what their name is or because of the kind of car that they're driving. All things that have nothing to do with the actual facts of somebody committing what will be considered a quote-unquote criminal offense. And I think that the people who have never been in the position to be mistaken for Ethan or be mistaken as fitting the description, they don't understand how far one negative interaction like this with a police officer, how far that can drop your confidence or your respect or the credibility of the institution of policing. How far that can drop that for somebody or how far that can delegitimize that for somebody. And especially when you do that to somebody's father and then the father teaches the child about what they've been through to try to make them aware, to try to make them cognizant of what they will have to deal with when they go out into the society. And that's been happening for generation upon generation upon generation of black people, of people of color, of poor people, of working class people. And I think that is how we get to a place where policing is not something that simply needs to be reformed. It has to be something that has to be abolished, and new institutions have to be put into its place. New systems need to be put into its place that are equitable, that don't have that history of unjustness and that history of discrimination. And I think that police officer safety is one of the things that are used regularly as an excuse after people are shot and killed, whether it be Tamir Rice having a BB gun and being shot and killed within seconds of the police officers arriving on the scene, and or whether it be people being shot while inside of their car, There's so many different ways in which after a macro aggression of police terrorism manifests, that police officers point to their fear of safety as to why they did it. And again, I think that's one of the reasons that it's important that we have to understand that police officers don't see themselves as part of the community. They don't see themselves as part of the citizenry. And so they don't the safety of the citizenry is not in the forefront of their mind. The safety of the community is not in the forefront of their mind. That's why that they shoot in the middle of busy streets. We've seen it happen here, shooting people in the middle of busy streets. They're not doing that because they're worried about not only their safety, but also the safety of the other citizens in the area. No, they're doing that because their safety is what is their belief of their safety or their desire for to enact this machismo ideology. They put those things above the safety of the citizens that they're supposed to be, quote unquote, protecting and serving. They put that above the safety of the neighborhoods that they are in. And so I think that as long as we have institutions where people are coming to, where officers are signing up to get their fill of adrenaline rush, they are. And I think another thing that has to be said is that the first part of this segment, this section that we read, when it talked about these police officers' desire for adventure and desire to enact their machismo mentality, that is the thing that creates their fear of safety, because they know that they violated people in such ways that people don't like the police or don't trust the police or see the police as a threat. And so it is their guilty conscience that makes them feel that every single person is a threat to them, or that every single person has a weapon, or that every single person is going to do something that's going to be physically detrimental to them, because they understand how regularly they use excessive force, how regularly they violate people's rights, and they understand the deep indignation that certain communities and certain people have and neighborhoods have for them because of the tumultuousness of the relationships that they have with those neighborhoods and those communities and those people. And so let's end this let's end this segment here. We're still on chapter 4. This is another episode of Rockford Reading Daily. We put these episodes out on a daily basis to present everybody the opportunity to either begin or further their struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Share this on whatever platform that you are listening to it on, and be on the lookout for the next episode of Rockford Reading Daily coming out tomorrow. And if you haven't listened to back episodes or previous episodes, go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading. All right, we outside.